You're listening to the AmWritingFantasy podcast. In today's publishing landscape, you can reach fans all over the world. Query letters are a thing of the past. You don't even need a literary agent. There is nothing standing in the way of making a living from writing. Join two best-selling authors who have self-published more than 20 books between them. Now, on to the show with your hosts, Burt and Jasper Schmidt.
Hello, I'm Autumn, and this is episode 153 of the AmWritingFantasy podcast. And this week we have Jasper on vacation and taking a bit of the break, which, I guess he deserves. But so instead, I have with me a different author, a sensitivity reader, and someone who writes fantasy, and I'm so looking forward to talking to her. So welcome to the podcast, Iona Wayland.
Hi there. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm so excited. Like I said, you're a tea drinker, you're a pet mom. This is going to be so much fun. And I even like the sensitivity. I can't wait to talk about that because I know my first story, my first passions were like, well, we have these giant epic fantasy quests and no one ever seems to come out the other side with like PTSD. So that was one of the first things that I thought of when I first started writing back in, 2010. So I cannot wait to talk to you. But first, go ahead and introduce yourself. I know you have your book Ashes, and tell us a little bit about that, and tell us, how you decided to become like a sensitivity reader.
Well, my day job is a trauma therapist. And by night, so to speak, I write. And Ashes is my debut. It's a dark fantasy novel. It has a Latinx main character named Angela, and she has to decide if she wants to journey and avenge her brother's death. And so it's those trials of figuring out herself in the midst of trying to save her brother.
Oh, that is cool. So he's dead. Is it saving his soul or saving him, or is that giving away too much of the book plot?
It won't give away too much. He is dead at the beginning of the book, but it explores what was behind his death and what is behind what his soul needs to pass on.
That is so cool. I
Thanks.
love it. Oh, that is fantastic. And I looked at the cover. I'm also a graphic artist, and I saw the cover. I'm like, cool, I like this. This is a very nice cover. So
I'm so glad you like the cover. I designed it. I'm not talented like what you're saying, but I did design. I was like, this is exactly what I want. Please, if you're able to do that. And they were. So that was nice.
Fantastic. Well, yeah, it came out really nice. I do like it. So, wow, you've been working with trauma. So that's already your interest and your background. And did that bring you to writing, or have you always been a fantasy reader or always wanted to be a fantasy writer?
I've always been a reader and a writer, to the point where before I even could write, I knew the alphabet or anything, I would watch cats out of alley cats out of my window as a little kid and write loop-de-loops. And that was my version of writing stories about the cats that I saw. So ever since then, I've just always wanted to be an author, and I'm definitely a reader. So fantasy is the main thing. But I really like all genres. There's not any that I dislike.
No, I think that's one of the benefits of being like an indie author, that if you want to do a cozy mystery / fantasy / something, we can mash those up and turn it into something really special.
Yes, it's true. It gets very niche. I love it.
Yes, very much so. So before we get into some of the topics, and I think it's interesting because it sounds like your writing tends towards inspiration, which is super cool and more like noble bright. But I have to ask what your favorite type of tea is, because I never get another tea enthusiast on the podcast.
Oh, that's hard. That's so hard. Well,
Sorry.
Right now I'm drinking an English breakfast.
Nice.
But oh man, my favorite tea. I have to say chai tea, which isn't really specific because chai just means tea.
Yeah.
But I like the spiced tea for sure is so delicious. And I'm really into bubble tea right now.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah, I definitely have that as my Wednesday treat to myself, middle of the week treat to myself. I'll get a bubble tea.
Oh, I love that. I'm not anywhere close to any place that sells bubble tea, so I will live vicariously through you for that one.
Yes. I definitely got lucky.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Well, chai tea, again, is a perfect answer for this time of the season and the fall.
Hmm.
We're recording this in October. So, yeah, we're all in the pumpkin spice attitude right now.
Yes. Yes, we are.
All right. So, this is Ash is your first one. Are you working on something else right now? Are you going to keep
I'm
writing?
actually working on a sequel,
Yay!
but there was a bunch of very happy but intense life stuff popping up that
Oh.
was really good and wonderful. But it also made writing go on the back burner for a little bit. But I am working on the sequel to that, and
Well,
the goal is to make it a sequel within the same universe, and the main characters of the first book are mentioned, or maybe even run into, but it is like a different main character this time.
oh, I like the ones like that, especially where you can, work in somebody from a previous book or a different book and they just do like a cameo. That it's
Yes.
fun. Very
Yeah, thank you.
cool. So yeah, I was like reading about what you do and as sensitivity. So you have to tell us what a sensitivity reader is and how you came up with that idea. But I was gonna say, looking at your own writing, you like to look at grief and surviving trauma and finding purpose and strength. And when I read that, I'm like, oh, you probably like as someone else put it, what's considered traditional fantasy, but they decided to start calling it noble bright, which is, it might go dark, but there's always that hope that's buried in there rather than
Mhm.
everything being dark and dire and you're wondering. I remember one of the first dark fantasies I read, it was really close to the end and his sister died. Everyone this person cared about had died and he's trudging through a swamp and I can't even remember what the purpose, what the final target and goal was. And I'm just like, if I was this character, I would just lay down in the swamp and I'm done. So that's the other side of dark fantasy, but it sounds like you try to pull out a little bit of that hope and the healing.
Yeah, I definitely am healing focused, and it's not saying that it's necessarily happy or what the character expected to have happen.
Hmm.
And there's still trauma from those experiences. And at the same time, I feel like healing is such a beautiful, intense process that all humans are capable of making. That I just wanted to make sure I depicted the human experience in that way in my writing for sure.
Oh, I love that. That is so, it's touching and I love not, it's one of those things when you're writing, some people like have a moral compass and it's almost like the fable where they're like doing a morality play and they're pushing the novel that way. But I do love it when you have characters and like you said, it's almost like a twist or it's not what they expect, it's not what they fear, but it's a different result. But I do love the
Mhm.
power of that change, the character arc. You probably work on that specifically, is to see a character go through this trauma, face it, and come out the other side one way or the other, or somewhere in between.
Mhm. Yes, exactly. I love some good character arcs for sure.
Oh, is there a special one that you like to see? Like, is there something you've recently read as a sensitivity reader, or even when you're writing, or just a book you picked up and you're like, gosh, that was a good healing? What made you think this is not only realistic, but just a very solid character arc, and maybe a little bit of a surprise?
There was one, so this is actually from a TV show that I've been watching, and it's an older TV show. But there was this character that was really annoying in the beginning, and he was kind of insufferable at
Oh.
times and very emotionally immature.
Mhm.
And as it's carried on, you could tell that his character arc was, instead of being insecure and overcompensating by
Mhm.
being kind of obnoxious, he was like, "No, you know what? I can do this. And if you believe me, then great, but if you don't, I'm still going to do it anyway." And he got to be like one of my favorite characters by the end of it. So I thought that was pretty cool to
Oh.
I had that whole like, this guy's like really annoying and I wonder if he's going to be written out. That's how annoying he is. Um, and it was really cool to see him thrive. It was very neat. So that is
That's
something that recently popped up for me.
that is fantastic. That's actually something I wish I had done in my debut novel. I have a character that I would describe him more as overly sensitive, maybe sliding towards manic depressive with highs and lows and often
Mm.
making bad choices.
Mhm.
And I've actually had a few readers be like, oh my gosh, I can't stand him. I want to skip his chapters. And I don't think I really ever healed him. If I ever go back to the story, I think, because there's always, I've done 2 trilogies and I like even things like 3 sets of 3. It's just, I'm half tempted to write another 3rd set, and I might have to finish up his character arc where, yeah, maybe people will not want to like drown him.
It can be done if that's what you decide. Yeah. So, but that would be a really cool character arc to see, having someone have like peaks and lows like that, being able to find more of a stability in between. That's pretty cool.
It was, but I have to say, especially having published that one in 2012, I've had definitely people not see why I did that. Like, they want to have an easy character, they want a character that makes sense in a character arc, and literally there's times he doesn't make sense because he's got emotional highs and lows that don't always jive with what's going on, or are a little extreme on either side. And I do see that as an issue, even though I try to bring out the nuances. Like, he's a little different in this society, he's a little unhinged, but to other people who are more stable. It's just the way he is. But I think people are getting it a little bit more now. I mean, it's been almost 10 years since I wrote it.
How crazy is that it's been almost 10 years since then?
No, and what's crazy is how much society has changed. I see a lot more nuances in characters where they are, maybe there's some mental health issues and other things, and that's brought up a little bit more, even in fantasy, where I think before it used to be more in nonfiction. So I think it's a little more understood, but I would say, I don't know if you would give us any hints or tips on that, but if you're writing a character that does have some stresses like post-traumatic stress or mental health issues, cluing the reader in that you're not just throwing a crazy character and making them erupt just to like make the plot tense, but that it's actually a character issue, an internal thing that's going on.
I really like that. I love when people are able to not like to show the nuances like you're talking about, and show that it's an inner character struggle and how it shows up for that character through symptoms is very cool when people are pulling them off in the correct way.
And
not that there's a one way. Yeah. That is what's hard. And there is not just one way. But that's where sensitivity readers come in. I read so sensitivity reading is where there's someone with expertise or the life experience or both, and they will read through a manuscript that has not been published yet, and they will point out depictions that may be harmful or inaccurate. So they really edit for inaccuracies in that regard. And then also I do diversity reading too, because I'm a mixed race woman of color, and I like being able to help in that regard as well.
Oh, that's fantastic. Oh, and that's so important with so many people being more interested in writing different perspectives and viewpoints and races and cultures. Even when you get into fantasy, I mean, even a dwarf is different from an elf versus a different color or other race. So that is cool that you can bring that out and see if the experience is, you know, like you said, authentic and valid and not just being cliched and stereotyped.
In writing, like, I think most authors and writers would agree that writing is very powerful. It depicts what's going on in our world. It shows, even if it's in a totally different realm, it shows what the author's points of views are and what those characters' points of views are and what they see. And so it's really important to make sure that the representation is accurate so that there's not a perpetuating cycle going on from generation to generation.
Yes, that's so true. I mean, I know I was paying attention when I just wrote a contemporary fantasy, urban fantasy, and part of it I have a Native American, as in Native American, more of a spiritual being, and to not fall in that cliche of the Native American who's a sage and knows all the answers, or, you know, all these other, you know, to make him an authentic character who happens also to be a Native American spirit who also has this history that he actually kind of doesn't quite understand. Like, so many teenagers are like, yeah, great, my grandfather's this great dude, and he's like, go out to the forest and go on a quest. And I'm like, what? So it is important, though, but because sometimes we don't even realize the stereotypes we're contributing to. I mean, I was just at a fantasy con, and I was on a panel for women in fantasy, and we decided that it was women characters, not just women authors. And I pointed out that so many times in the US as a student, all of our examples are he, and it's always he and she or something. You know, the guy is always first. And I'm like, you know what? Screw that. I started all of my pronouns, all my example cases are now female. Or sometimes I'll do 50-50. I'll switch back and forth, but I always start with the woman first. I always put she first. Because why? Why is the default he? And, you know, it only took me like 40 years to figure that one out.
And there's so many different like nuances too to gender expression and experiences and stuff. Like, why start with he?
Yeah.
You know?
Exactly.
Yeah, I love that. I really love that.
Yeah. And even like you were saying, I mean, I just finished the Le Bartigo, the Grishaverse books. And my gosh, kudos to her. She has non-binary, transgender. I mean, she has it all, and it was so fantastic to read. I'm like, I can imagine the fantasy I read, because I grew up in a very conservative, very Christian, very rural place, and I know the fantasy I read changed my perspective of who I became. And I'm thinking, my goodness, if I could have read the Grishaverse and when I was 13, 14, 15, and they thought Dungeons and Dragons was bad, holy crap, this would have totally blown me out of the water.
I think that shows the power of writing and why it's so important to have accurate representation. It can really change people's lives. It's truly incredible.
So, I mean, as a sensitivity reader, what are the steps that you do when you look to help an author and what you're reading? What are you looking for that says this is an authentic experience versus, well, this might be, you know, the wrong way to go?
Oh, that's a good question. Okay, so one of the things I see most often is when certain races or ethnicities or mental health experiences are experienced like a monolith. So like there's like 3 examples. So like let's use depression. That's something that a lot of people experience and struggle to overcome or do overcome. And that is something that I think what a lot of people think is depression means sad. And so if that's the only presentation of depression, there's nothing that shows what actually is making that depression for that character. Like, everyone feels sad,
right?
But depression's different. There's way more reactions and symptoms that someone can go through. It can be very diverse. That could be having difficulty getting up in the morning. That can be staring off into space in the middle of the workday. That can be forgetting to brush your teeth or take a shower for a while and then being like, oh shoot, how long has it been? Or not having the energy to do that. Or some people even experience physical pain of that. So I look for if there's any like broad strokes oversimplification of mental health or any other kinds of experiences in the author's work. I think that way I can be like, let's be a little more specific. And how does it show up for your character specifically?
Oh, I so like that. It reminds me of, like, you know, I often teach like writing with the 5 senses. We so rely on visual, and then we might have sound because dialogue is sound. But it's like touch, taste, all of these other things are a way of experiencing the world and doing your world building. It helps bring the world to life if you can touch it. So you're saying the same thing, like with depression, you know, even, to me, I'm a huge foodie. So it's like losing that drive for like good taste, being like, yeah, it's just whatever, you know, that's all a sign. And it also gives more depth to your character and more depth to the experience. Oh, I like that so much.
I'm glad. And I'm glad you talk about the different senses. I remember my world being like totally blown away when I learned that there was more than 5 senses. Like, not, well, there's the 5 main ones, but like there's like balance. Like if something feels off kilter, there's heat, hot and cold. There's like, I mean, there's like 20 more or something like that. But I remember, like, at the very least, let's bring in the 5 senses. But there's also all these other things too that we can add on there for the whole experience.
Exactly. And I always looked at it, even the 6th sense, the traditional sixth sense is mind or soul, spirit. So it's like,
Yes,
that's where
yes.
the
Good
mental
point.
health comes in. It's not just
Mhm.
intelligence, but it's how well you deal with things. And that is such an
Mhm.
interesting, we talk about personality tests to develop your character, but looking at
Mhm.
just how reactive, how adaptive are they mentally to big changes. Some people are going to break very quickly, and some people
Mhm.
are going to be surprising, and they're going to be able
Mhm.
to change and flow, but eventually something might trip them up. And it's part of knowing your character, knowing how they're mentally and emotionally handling the things these hurdles that you're throwing at them, or letting them fall in love and then yanking that away. How are they're just not
Mhm.
going to be like, oh wow. There's a deeper impact to those
There's
things.
definitely a consequence to that. Yeah, a deeper impact for sure.
Very cool. So what are some tips besides, don't so we have don't just dwell on one aspect. Like, definitely do your homework. If you're gonna have a character who's depressed, looked at some of the other symptoms that are there. Like if they're manic depressive, understand what the highs and the lows are,
Mhm.
and find a way of explaining that. Like I said, I can see readers being still startled if you have a character that is truly going through a mental health crisis or has some issues. And especially when you come into across it in fantasy, it's still not traditional to have those things, but they're creeping in there. But it
Mhm.
helps to clue in the reader somehow, saying, I'm not just being over exaggerative of this one character. There's a real reason. I mean, is there some clues or some tips you can give us that are a way of letting people know that this is, these are the things that are happening to this character are for a reason, on purpose?
Yeah, I definitely tell people to develop the character first.
Hmm.
Develop the character first, because having a mental injury or mental illness is not a character trait. If someone's like, oh my gosh, they're so anxious, that doesn't really tell me anything about the character at all. That is just conveying a diagnosis,
Oh.
or someone questioning if maybe they might have this diagnosis. Like,
Uh-huh.
I want you to know, are they extroverted, introverted, ambiverted?
Mhm.
Do they out loud process, internally process? Are they quick to anger? Like, do they have a quick fuse, or are they really patient? Like, how do they process the world? How do they react to other people? What do they hold dear? What do they push
Mm.
away? Those kinds of things. And then you can add the diagnosis, because you already know your character as a person. Because I think that sometimes there will be writers who will have someone have their villain origin story is that they are bipolar, and it's like, well, that doesn't really tell me anything.
That's true.
There are lots of people who are bipolar. There's different kinds of bipolar. Like, tell me about your character first, and then just show don't tell, really
Yeah.
show me what their symptoms are. And I think that's important to remember, also not to always villainize those with mental health either, because that's a big thing that I see very frequently, and it's kind
Oh,
of
that's interesting.
cliche now, I think.
Yeah, I was just about when you said the villain being bipolar, I'm like, oh, but isn't that a stereotype too? I mean, that's
It
like
is.
just like the Joker or something in Batman. It
Ugh.
should not always be the mentally ill who goes off the deep end. You can have a way. I think it's interesting because I've even read fantasy recently where there was someone who was going through issues, and I think the elves came up with a drug for them. I'm like, oh my goodness, we're getting into pharmaceuticals now. This is fantastic. But you can be a healthy, productive member of society and just be different. My nephew actually has Asperger's, and
Mhm.
it kind of runs in my family. We're all very literal. Like if you see a sign on the road that says like road drops 500 feet, our immediate thought is the road is going to fall 500 feet. What?
Mhm.
No, we have a very literal interpretation, but it's just a different way of seeing the world. It's just our
Mhm.
lens of the world is slightly different from most other people. But again, what is most other
Exactly.
people? What is normal? This is normal for
Yeah.
me.
I don't think there's such thing. I think normal is made up. Or
I
as a therapist joke is, it's a setting on your washer machine.
That's true. It doesn't say average, like normal cycle. That's true. I like
Mhm.
that.
Mhm.
I'm going to use that from now on to defend myself.
And I do think that what you're saying is like, yeah, like you process the world, or family members are on the spectrum or autistic, and they process the world in a different way, but it's also not different.
Yeah.
It's also just how you process it. So I would love to see an autistic character with those kinds of like the ability, the different abilities and disabilities portrayed there with that disorder.
Yeah.
I don't even like calling it a disorder.
I
It's
agree.
someone not and I am not neurotypical, so I'm neurodivergent myself.
Excellent.
So I think that it's very cool to see all kinds of representation in writing.
I think it's important too, and that's one of the things I do love. That I mean, I did grow up in the '80s, and it seemed like it was all the male characters, you know, He-Man or something, and they're wearing swords and they're going off and saving the women. And I was always at least neuroatypical enough to usually just be able to put myself in the place of the hero. It didn't matter. I was a tomboy. Thank goodness. I actually just realized this the other day, that my brother never said I couldn't do something because I was a girl. We were like playing cowboys and Indians together. He let me play with his matchboxes. I'm like, oh my goodness. How much of my weird view of life comes from my brother not treating me like a younger brother instead of a little girl? All the way down to trying to draw and quarter me once, but we won't go there. But
the joys of sibling relationships.
I love writing about them. They're so horribly wonderful, but it is true. It's those different viewpoints and the diversity of viewpoints that make even a quest group. You don't want every single person the same. And I know one of the advices I give is like, if you're having a problem telling your characters apart, which one your readers will then have a problem, but give them like a totem. Like this one's the fox, this one's the owl. You know, do something so that you understand their differences, some kind of way of seeing them differently. And I think that goes for even how they
That's
think.
a cool way, especially like if the person's like indigenous and they understand the backgrounds behind like what totems mean. But if you aren't indigenous and you want to try something else, you could also do like smells. This one author, and now I forget who said it, but that doesn't help. But she was like, you can use smells like scents. And like imagine that they're a candle, what would it be? I know for me, sometimes I'll imagine characters wearing certain colors, just because color is so important to me, and having those different like connections with color and what they mean for me, and how I can tell like my characters apart and what makes them different from each other.
Yeah, that's when I wrote my debut. That was how I managed to get into character's head. I actually wrote in a different color font for each of the characters.
Neat.
And
See, that is so helpful, isn't it?
It was so helpful. I knew then to stay if I was trying to do all chapters in one point of view. So I knew to stay. If I'm in red, I was in tie, and I had to stay in tie. And it really helped me learn a lot better. But I like that smells. That also gives you a totally different perspective and reminds you to use your other senses.
It does. I really hadn't thought of it until this person said it, and now I wish I could remember this person's name.
That's okay. I'm sure, well, you know, Google, I would say we can Google them, but yeah, that sometimes doesn't work. There's just so much out there anymore. Well, that's really cool. So I love that you do this kind of reading and sensitivity reading for both mental health as well as races and stereotypes. And when you do it, like character arc wise, what are some tips you can say for like showing a character shifting from the one side of their arc to the other? Like, are there good turning point issues, or what are ways of showing that they're healing and moving on?
Oh, that's a really great question. Something that I think is helpful to show with healing is that it's not linear. So I think a lot of people, even their expectation for therapy sometimes is like, okay, I'm going to have like 6 sessions, and then on the 7th one, there'll be a big epiphany, and then I'll be fixed, whatever that even means. And it's like, well, that's not quite how it works. And that's not how it's going to work for characters either.
No.
So I think it'll be cool to show like, you know, their tolerance might get longer. Like when they usually are like really quick to anger, maybe show that their tolerance before they blow up is lasting a little bit longer and a little bit longer, or they're able to tolerate another character a little bit longer than usual. Or if someone has a hard time accepting accolades or like compliments, then showing that change in their affect from being able to just brush off, be like, no, this is, it's like, wow, you really saved me, like you're a hero, and then being like, I'm not a hero. Like we see that so much in fantasy, like I'm not a hero, I'm just doing my job. But getting to a point where they're empowered enough to accept that they did something very difficult and very brave and courageous is very, very beautiful. I also love, because I love seeing this, because this is how it happens in real life, is when people regress. So there will be these accomplishments, and then they might break a little and use an old maladaptive coping strategy that they haven't used for months or a year or whatever. And then they go back to doing that. And then they're like, oh, was this all for nothing? And of course it's not all for nothing, but showing that like, I've been different. I'm different now. Like, but why did I do this? And showing how they come back from that again and again. And, I know someone told me once, that healing is kind of almost like cyclical, where it'll go in a circle. You're going forward like a wheel, but you have some patterns that you have to break out of that take some time, and you might repeat them.
Oh, I love that. It reminds me of the Enneagram, which has like the 9 stages for each of the key personality types. And so it's like you can move up and down the scale. And it's not just villains moving down, but you can have a character that starts really high and they can go down and they can go back up and they can go back down. I mean, I remember again one of my favorite characters, and he starts off pretty high. He's pretty kick-ass. But he the second book, there's a huge event at the end of the second one. He loses his sister, and he just kind of crumbles and he slides down. And some people were really mad at me, but I'm like, this is legit. This is, people go through things. I've lost siblings. It changes you. And I'm surprised that some people didn't want to see a character go down, maybe he went from a positive arc to a negative arc in one book, and then he came back up to the third book. That's what a trilogy is for, right?
Absolutely. And that's how it is, like you're saying, in real life. Like grief, that's something that I heavily explore in Ashes. I think they used to think that it was like the stages of grief. Oh, yeah. It's not stages. It's a swinging pendulum. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know. Yes. And you can move back and forth all throughout your life. For the rest of your life, it's going to affect it. You're going to miss that person. And that's what I really wanted to show. Yeah. And there are times when Angela, my main character, she will sometimes handle things really well and use her resilience and use her like, I'm going to do this for my family kind of attitude. And then there are other times where she's like, wow, what am I doing here? Like,
it's so
is
true,
this even going to work? Yeah, it's true. It's realistic.
And I love that. And again, I mean, just because it's fantasy in a fantasy setting or has magic doesn't mean that the emotions aren't real. I mean, that's how we can pretend to be a dragon or pretend to be an elf or any other species that we come up with, is those really the emotional connections. And that's also what draws us to characters. And that's why I think explaining it so that as someone who hasn't experienced grief or hasn't experienced someone in their family who has mental health issues might not quite will actually get it a little bit. And I think that's really important, is to not just make some people go, this doesn't make any sense, but try to draw out the realism and say, this is how it is for some people.
And I think that's really important.
Yeah. Well, is there any other tips you can think of that you think would really help writers, talk about how to write? Even, we talked a lot about mental health, but even bringing out cultural differences, how not to fall into those stereotypical traps, or how to even question, when you're developing a character, is there a certain point where you're like, where do you stop and ask yourself, am I just being a stereotype with this person?
Well, it's hard to know what biases, because we all have biases that we don't know about, which is
Yes.
why it's lovely to have critique
Oh,
partners.
yes.
My advice is to include the community if you can, like, of whatever you're writing about. So like
Mm,
if you're an allistic person and you're writing an autistic character, then you should have some autistic beta readers. Um,
nice.
if you're not able to do, I obviously support someone doing sensitivity reading, or having a sensitivity reader, I should say. But if the person doesn't want to do that, then having the community help them, and then being very open to feedback about that. Because I think even though we can have biases if we have certain disorders or if we have certain backgrounds, like racial and ethnic backgrounds, I think there's more room for biased error when we
Mm,
don't share that community. So that's why it's so
yes.
important to include the community there. And just making sure to unlearning certain things does not feel very good, but
That's very true.
overall it will improve your writing.
Oh, that's so very true. And I know as I love question. I swear I didn't question anything as a teenager. I've made up for it as I've gotten older, but
I think that's part of being a
I
teenager.
think so.
What an
You're just
experience.
rebellious. Oh, but it is very important. I mean, when I sit down to create a character and I go with my first gut assumption, it's like a female or a male, and I always stop. Why? What color? Why do I feel like it
Mhm.
should be that way? And I think that's so important is to
Mhm.
question basically it's exhausting, but when it comes to your main
Mhm.
characters or even your sub characters, I know I was reading something, helping a writing coach with something, and it seemed like every default character was a male. The doctor was a male, the nurses were female. I'm like, come on, wake up.
Mhm.
2020, 2021 even. No,
Yeah.
your doctors are now female, your nurses are now male. Deal with it. And but
Mhm.
it sneaks in there, and sometimes I think you're
Mhm.
right. I saw it because I wasn't the author, and so I really noticed it.
Mhm.
I mean, I think if I went back to something I'd written ages ago and I looked at it with a clean slate, I would also go like, "Oh my gosh, why did I choose that?"
Mhm. I've definitely looked at my old writing and been like, "Well, I've certainly grown because I know these certain thought processes are not accurate anymore."
But,
Never
we
have been, but I really thought they were.
I think we all deserve to be able to grow. I always feel bad even if it
Mhm.
is for politicians, which it's hard to feel bad for politicians, but it's like in 20, 30 years ago you voted on this. Oh, for goodness sakes, let them change. People can change their
Mhm.
mind over 30 years. Your writing will
Mhm.
change. Don't
It
be
will.
afraid, I guess, to try writing a different culture, writing a different species. I know with my first books, I remember thinking I wanted a fantasy race. I didn't want elves. What color should they be? And I was thinking
Mhm.
black. Yeah, I was trying to go through everything, but I wanted to be fantasy. And I finally made their skins the color of bark. So, go ahead, be
Mhm.
different. Come up with something totally new. That's fine too. Don't be
Yeah.
afraid of trying it. But yeah, make sure you probably check in with someone else, some beta readers, some sensitivity readers to make sure you're
Mhm.
not off the wall and going to
Yeah.
offend.
The bark thing reminded me, this is not me saying your elves are bad. They're
Oh
not.
no.
It's not. I promise this is something totally different. It just reminded me of, that's something that has changed a lot, is the description of eye color, hair color, skin color.
Yeah.
It used to be that apparently everyone's default white for some reason, and then anyone else would be compared to food, um
Oh.
and so they would be like chocolate
Oh
skin for
right.
someone who's black,
Coffee.
or
Mocha.
like
Yeah.
mocha, yeah,
I remember.
caramel.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that wasn't really, I mean, I'm sure it was harmful, because anytime you describe someone as food related, it's like, that's a bit othering, I would think, especially if you
Yeah.
don't do it for one race, like the white race.
Yeah. No
But
kidding.
it's cool to see like how that's changed, and how authors, like, there are authors who didn't know that that was harmful, and they learned, and they
Yeah.
were like, okay, that's an easy fix, and they just put that in there. And I love, that's what I love seeing, like, as a sensitivity reader, is not the mistake. I don't care if someone makes a mistake because it just is something that they're going to grow from.
Mhm.
I do care if they don't listen to, not that they don't have to rewrite their book or anything, usually. Sometimes that does have to happen. But it's just like, are they listening to the feedback of like, hey, here's a bit of an educational piece as to why this isn't working. 10 years ago, 20 years ago, it may have worked, but we've found that it's harmful. And here's why. And here's a way to do it a different way. And when people are like, oh, that makes sense, will do. I'm like, see, that was not difficult.
That's very true.
Yeah.
And it's so much better to get it on, from a sensitivity reader versus seeing it as a review on Amazon or Goodreads and being blasted for either cultural appropriation or being harmful with stereotypes. It
hurts. It can hurt a lot of people. It has the potential to. Yeah.
We're in a global community and a global society. And so all of our stuff, as much as we wish it was simpler, you have to be culturally and mental health. You have to be aware that all of these things are out there, and you should write the best you can. And I still say there are times where you might choose to do something that's a little harsh, but always make it a choice. Have an answer if someone says, why did you do this? If you have an answer that's legit, that's fine.
It means you were intentional with it. Yeah.
Just be intentional. I like that. Yes.
The intentions, and I like what you were saying too. Always question your motivation. Why?
Yes.
And then be intentional when you write is so important. And I think that's very, very cool.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us. And of course, I'm going to put links to your webpage, but please to go ahead and tell people how to find you. So if they're interested in learning more about sensitivity reading, that they know where to look you up.
Yes. Okay. So I am most active on Instagram, and that's Iona.Wayland. And I'm sure you'll have that information too. But my book is available in ebook, paperback, and it just released as audiobook. I was very excited to work with Melissa Medina. They did a wonderful voice of Angela and brought her story to life beautifully. And then on my website, if you have inquiries about sensitivity reading rates or questions or anything of that sort, you can send me information. You can send me your question or your manuscript or whatever have you through at the very bottom of my webpage. And you can sign up for my monthly newsletter.
Oh, I didn't see the newsletter. I might go back and get that because I think I want to stay in touch. That'd be fantastic.
Oh, thank you.
Great. Thanks again so much for joining us. And next week, Jasper will be back. Actually, he'll be solo, and he'll have another fantastic interview lined up for you.
If you like what you just heard, there's a few things you can do to support the AmWritingFantasy podcast. Please tell a fellow author about the show and visit us at Apple Podcast and leave a rating and review. You can also join Autumn and Jasper on patreon.com/AmWritingFantasy. For as little as $1 a month, you'll get awesome rewards and keep the AmWritingFantasy podcast going. Stay safe out there and see you next Monday.